I'd like to start today with a confession. This is the first industry-led conference I've ever attended. I'm not in the business world or the design world. I'm a sociologist, and I'm interested in the ways that technology shapes social interaction, human relationships, and sexual experiences. Usually, I attend academic conferences, and when I do, you may be unsurprised that it is actually very easy for me to capture audience attention. I most often jump up and start with a big, bold question, such as, how do you imagine the future of sex? I then proceed to talk about sex robots and throw around catchy terms like teledildonics. And academics may no longer wear tweed jackets and spectacles, but the topic of sex, especially sex fused with technology, is no less titillating, unusual, and still a little bit taboo. In these forums, it's common for the audience to be instantly engaged and begin a debate of the ethical dilemmas of love with machines, of sex with robots. But for everyone watching today, you'll know all too well that this is only a very tiny part of the story. In fact, it's the sensationalized story that is so often capitalized on by the media, and apparently also by me. In movies, the future of sex has often been used as a story trope. It's been the teleported sex partner in Logan's Run, pill-enabled sex with Jane Fonda in Barbarella, and a man falling in love with AI in Her. In 1972, Ira Levin also imagined a world in Stepford, where men chose to replace their wives with slightly more attractive, more perfect, and more compliant love robots. And it's this very fear of replacement, of fundamental social disruption, that people will reject humans in place of machine love, is what so often attracts media attention. Overwhelmingly, the focus is on the potential risks of technology, covering everything from the harms of youth sexting to the possibility of addiction to increasingly immersive sex technologies. In these discussions, the biggest fear is this imagined future. But what's often neglected is the fact that the future is already here. It happened yesterday. It happened when the early dial telephones of the 1930s and 50s facilitated phone sex, when the Polaroid camera made sexy selfies so much more accessible, and when the VCR brought porn from the cinema to the private home. Far from the disruptive, sensationalized dystopian future of sex, many technologies are now incredibly common within people's sexual relationships. It's the technologies that are so ordinary that we don't even think about them. Or when it comes to our phones, we can't even imagine living without them. At the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, we've sought to better understand the way that these technologies have become integrated into people's sexual and dating practices. We've been asking, actually, what are the emerging social, legal, and ethical questions that arise from the fusion of human sexuality with technology? The project began with speaking with Australian adults that take sexy photos and videos of themselves to connect with strangers, lovers, and partners. Too often, the focus of sexting has been on the risks for young people, with little consideration for how using cameras in the bedroom allows adults to experience feelings of empowerment, for them to forge connections and really reflect on what makes them feel good. While we haven't yet published findings from this part of the study, it was clear from talking to people that while technologies have changed, social taboos have not. One person told me about building a darkroom in the 1980s to develop the photos he took of his lovers because it simply wasn't socially acceptable to have these pictures developed at the local chemist. But younger adults also had anxieties about other people finding out about their sexting practices. Despite the fact that these practices are actually really common, adults still remain quite fearful of social judgment and stigma. Over the past year or so, I don't need to tell you that tech sex took on a whole new significance as COVID-19 resulted in social distancing and lockdowns around the world, with many people confined to their houses. We also started to see the media discussion of sex, tech, and risk change during this time. When the pandemic was a bigger risk than technology, avenues of connecting remotely with others became more acceptable and even more promoted within the mainstream media. There were articles talking about Zoom sex parties, Wi-Fi enabled sex toys, and a whole lot of FaceTime video sex. This was an incredible time for us as researchers to really explore how people were facilitating sex in Australia during these strange and unfamiliar times. We conducted a survey with Australian adults, asking them to reflect on their use of tech to facilitate not only sex and intimacy, but also connection, both before and after COVID-19. And while we're still working through the Australian data, similar research published by the Kinsey Institute found that in the US, despite the fact that the majority of people reported a decrease in the quality of their sex lives, 1 in 5 tried new things during their sex lives during COVID-19, most of which actually included tech addictions. Sexting, watching porn online, and having cybersex were some of the most popular, suggesting that when having sex in person is restricted, technology provides creative ways for people to experience connection and pleasure. During this project, I've also been speaking with people that use smart technologies, such as remote-controlled vibrators, and those that create them. And I've learned that some of the same social taboos and restrictions that affect the industry also impact on our capacity to do research within the space. I now know all too well what those seeking to advertise via Facebook, for example, experience in constant ad rejections and revisions. When trying to advertise for this project and recruit participants, I tried endless number of wording and picture combinations, often having to resort to a range of euphemistic terms, such as lifestyle toys, in an attempt to have ads approved. These restrictions in of themselves raise a number of important questions about what the impact is of our inability to speak publicly about sexual pleasure. How do these taboos impact on the ways that sex is broadly regarded in a society? For which groups of people is access to sex and pleasure regarded as somehow more acceptable? And how can consumers become aware of different products? How can they compare the different qualities of those products as they would when, for example, buying a TV or a new laptop? At a very basic level, what does this mean for consumer choice in sex lives? When we decided to speak with sex tech designers, I first imagined talking to those that are part of designing and producing remote-controlled sex toys. I'll confess that in my mind, this is what smart sex was. But along this journey, what I've come to regard as smart and understand of as technology has become increasingly blurred. I've spent a lot of time thinking and trying to work out where the boundaries are of what constitutes smart sex, of tech-infused sex, and I've come to realize that things as simple and as common as condoms are also a form of technology that has radically changed the way that people can experience sex. As part of this project, I've been fortunate to connect and speak with people involved in the sex tech industry from around the world. And we've been able to see that sex tech is more than just a business. It's a social movement that seeks equality in sexual pleasure, with a focus on inclusion, diversity, and female-led design. Designers are pushing to use the latest technologies to make sex toys and devices better and safer. With limited regulation of sex toys around the world and instances of harmful and dangerous devices, the industry is really leading the charge to ensure that sex toys are made of safe materials, components, and ingredients. And I've been particularly interested in learning about what those in sex tech foresee as future trends, as here too, there are a number of interesting questions, because at the end of the day, it is the imaginations of the designers, founders, and engineers that helps to shape the ways that people will engage in intimacy, connection, and experience new forms of sexual pleasure. I've wondered about the connection between fiction and imagination. Does sex tech inspire literature in this space? Or has literature helped to inspire designers? And these are only questions that you can answer for me. However, as with all technologies, there remains the potential for people to take new objects, new devices, and use them in ways that had not been anticipated or expected. This too can result in added responsibility for designers in thinking through the potential outcomes of the technologies they put into the world. One of the most obvious examples seen of this has involved the hacking of toys and devices, when another person is, without the user's permission, able to take control of a toy in use. Situations such as these raise really important legal and ethical questions. In the case of a hacking like that, is that sexual assault? What about when a toy is reprogrammed by a hacker? What does that mean for consent? And how can we stop behavior like this? What about if people use deep fake technology to generate porn of others without their consent? And do you need consent to program a virtual reality avatar to look like your ex? Of course, these questions don't even begin to address the topics of data and privacy. And while issues of data are not unique to Sextech, given the ongoing moral taboos around sex, it is not impossible to imagine a world where, if not properly protected, your sex data may be used against you, either as blackmail or as part of, for example, assessing your home loan application. The law has typically been slow to respond to changes in technology, and examples of this can be seen in the ways that many laws have in the past inadequately responded to youth sexting by criminalizing young people. Revenge porn or non-consensual uploading of sexual or naked images also continues to be a difficult space to address and regulate, in part because of the global nature of the internet. This is coupled with what seems to be minimal regulation of sex toys and devices around the world without unified standards for things like materials. As technologies become increasingly immersive, sophisticated, and autonomous, there will be further questions as to their safety and ethics. If, for example, something does indeed go wrong with an autonomous device, who is ultimately responsible? The programmer or the consumer? And what are the ethics of programming a device to make a human feel as though it does return feelings? These are some important questions. However, regulating within the tech sex space raises important considerations. On the one hand, social taboos around sex may make regulating sex technologies for consumer safety an undesirable political stance. Regulating sex technologies may also risk unwanted legal intervention, laws that go too far, that seek to restrict the space based on taboos around sex rather than consumer safety. This does, however, raise questions about what other avenues may be important for ensuring the safety of sex technologies. There are opportunities to think about possibilities for ethical self-regulation via the industry, involving increased collaboration and representation within the space. In addition, this may also point to the need for greater education around technologies in sex education programs, keeping in mind that adults are also in need of learning to navigate tech sex, especially when they are not as well versed in technologies as some younger people. As we move forward through our research project, we'll be conducting a large Australian survey that explores young people's experiences with sex as facilitated by technology. We'll be looking at a wide array of sex tech use, including sexting, watching and creating pornography, sex toys, and dating apps. We want to know exactly who is using what kinds of technology, not only to get off, but also to form intimate connections with other people. We want to know how other people feel about using these experiences. Are they life-changing, difficult, or just an ordinary part of sex today? In talking about sex tech, it is necessary that we talk about the way that history and society has shaped our current technologies and the enduring legacy that this has had. Our vision is to promote deeper discussions and ensure that together we can future-proof the legal, social, and educational responses to our sexual revolution. Until now, discussions of tech sex have too often fed into fears and sensationalized the most visible of these technologies. People using the tech have been positioned as putting themselves in danger or just kinda a bit out there. We hope to help change this conversation, to show the ways that technology is already facilitating sex, and that it may not be as scary or perhaps even as exciting as people first think. And that for many, this future of sex is already in the palm of their hands, and they didn't even realize it. I hope that the topics I've raised today have provided you with insight as to how those of us within research are thinking about sex tech and its possibilities for shaping human connection. But more importantly, I hope the topics discussed have prompted your own thinking about your work, about the potential for new discussions, for collaborations, and for the ways that sex tech has transformative potential to connect people in new and exciting ways, but also raises concerns and issues that will need to be negotiated to ensure safety and well-being. This thinking is incredibly important and valuable because at the end of the day, while the future of sex is here, you are already shaping the next stage. Thank you.